Home for Christmas, Part 1. Snow had been falling all day on the mountain, and now, as the filtered light of late afternoon melted into the grays and the blues of evening, a winter calm spread across the landscape, connecting trees and bushes and the occasional bunny and swirls of movement. Frank stuffed his hands in his pockets out of habit to keep warm, and drew his chin back inside the red and white striped scarf that his mother had made him when he was little. He paused and took in the landscape, and he saw around him as well as the inner landscape of his memories and feelings. It happened every year. Part of him would come back here at this time, no matter where he had been during the year, no matter what he had seen. Coming home for Christmas was unlike anything else. But this was the first time he had actually been here in person. He moved through the woods, aware of where the well-worn path was, even though it was no longer visible under the white covering. Memories of snowshoeing here, and the crunch of breaking through the crust on top of the latest snowfall that had melted in sunlight before refreezing. That time he saw a hawk sitting atop the now leafless elm tree looking for breakfast. He knew this land. This land knew him. He knew her soul, and he couldn't wait to see all the others who he just knew would also be arriving over the next few hours. In the clearing up ahead, he could already see the yellow light pouring out of the doorway and the colored lights from the stained glass windows making their mosaic on the ground like an aura around the old wooden building that beckoned him onward. It wasn't that his heart quickened at the sight, as much as it was that he felt something in the core of his being. What was it? A familiarity with the scene? A sense of relaxing into his own breath as every step brought him nearer? He had grown up in this church, playing outside with Tom and Jerome, teasing Rebecca, until he had dared to ask her to a dance when they were in high school. And this is where they were married. This is where they baptized and raised their own children. The big front door was always open. Light poured out of it, making the pathway into the old wooden building come alive, inviting everyone in. And once he stepped inside, the heater above the doorway gushed out enough heat to take the chill off every person who entered. "I wondered when you'd get here," Jerome said to him, and the two old friends hugged. It always seemed like an eternity between their visits, though, in fact, not a Christmas had gone by that they hadn't thought about each other for as long as each could remember. As they talked and got caught up with each other's travels, the choir warmed up on Christmas carols. Mrs. Stanley was still at the organ, and all these years later was still reminding Raymond to hold his music up. It was easy to tell how happy the 12 or 13 singers were to be together again on this night, singing of Christ's birth. With the choir sitting next to the organ in the front left corner, the creche was set up at the right, on what Frank had always called the stage, even though countless people, including his own daughter, Emily, had told him time and again was really called the chancel. It was raised up. There were 3 steps from where the people sat, and everybody on it was above the congregation, so it was a stage as far as he was concerned. But remembering those corrections by Emily made him smile. "Where are all the others?" he asked. Still downstairs, cleaning up from dinner," Jerome said. "They'll be up soon enough." "Is Tom here?" he asked quietly, almost reverently. "Not yet," Jerome answered. placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. But he'll be along soon. Others began to enter. Many of them he recognized, though there were some who had started coming to the church long after he had. By now he knew them only by sight, and yet they too had become part of his homecoming each Christmas. There was Thad, the skateboarder. He carried that board with him even in the winter, and the men never quite got used to seeing all his tattoos and piercings. Remember when those things were only for sailors and steel workers? Jerome whispered, and Frank nodded, wondering who would be the next to come through the doors. Each person and each memory they brought filled his interior landscape with comfort and joy. These last few years, he had really come to appreciate that term, comfort and joy. He had thought times were hard before, but lately, the whole world seemed to need comfort, and it certainly needed joy. Destiny was next to come through the doorway, carrying her baby, Shamira. A beautiful young woman of color. She nodded and smiled to the two men, adding, "Good to see you again." And she stomped snow off her feet while moving to the place that she had staked out for herself in the pews. People were emerging from the cellar now, still continuing conversations that they had begun over supper. The church had been built in the days when the cellar was the social hall. The buildings were kept compact then, before central heating, and everyone made the best use of the space. A few who emerged headed straight for the choir loft, picked up a hymnal, and joined right in with the others who were singing "O Little Town of Bethlehem." Dr. Lindstrom took his place in the center of the bass section. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over the others, especially Mrs. Barker, who stood at about 4'11" and sang soprano right in front of him. But everyone was welcome, and Frank felt good seeing all of these old, familiar faces that he'd grown up with. Miss Hubbard sang alto. She had never married, but she could read music. Her father had been a music teacher, so she was assigned the alto part, and old Joe Spencer, hands calloused from his farm work, had long ago given up the farm to his sons, Pete and Joe Jr. Joe still had a nice lyric tenor voice that one could easily distinguish whenever the choir sang. Over at the right, people were greeting Joe Jr. He hadn't been home for Christmas in a long time now, and this was his first trip back. It gladdened his father's heart. Frank could tell. Joe Sr.'s eyes brightened, and he brushed away a tear of joy before anyone could see it. Anyone except Frank, that is. He didn't miss much. As a writer and one-time war correspondent, Frank took everything in. Frank and Jerome headed toward the stairway up to their seats in the balcony. They had claimed their seats when they were just kids on one Christmas Eve. It was one of those rare years when there wasn't any snow, and the boys, both about 10 at the time, had shredded their bulletins into tiny pieces and during Silent Night had sprinkled them over the balcony railing to give the impression of snow falling on the people below. Well, old Mr. Johnson didn't think that was funny one little bit. He headed up those stairs to grab them by the scruff of the necks, but on the way he got tangled in Mrs. Henry's skirt and fell flat on his face just as the congregation was singing "All is Calm, All is Bright." Over time, Mr. Johnson and the boys, now grown men of course, had mended fences, and now they no longer shredded anything. But hearing them take their seats above him, Mr. Johnson stood beneath them and looked up, smiled, and waved at them both with a warmth that let them know, well, both that he was remembering that same Christmas Eve from long ago and that he was glad to see them again. Frank and Jerome sat down, watching people continue to file in, all different ages. All of the McIntyre family was together for the first time. Finally. It had been years, but they were all there. Mr. and Mrs. McIntyre and all 7 kids. And they sat where they always had, 2 rows from the front, because Mrs. McIntyre thought it would keep the kids in line to have everybody see them from behind. It took her years to know that each of her children would eventually figure out how to reach around the back of the pew and torture their siblings with hair pulling and pinching or tickling, which, of course, everyone else in the congregation could see. And on the rare occasions when her husband actually attended the service, she could feel all puffed up because everyone saw him in the second row. Tonight, though, they were all just thrilled to be together. Mr. McIntyre had owned the local pharmacy before it was bought out by that big box chain store, so he knew practically everybody there that night. Nobody needed a pharmacist, though, not tonight. Just being together was the greatest elixir of all. "Who is that?" Frank asked Jerome, pointing to a young woman in army fatigues. "I don't remember seeing her before." "Nope, this is her first time home. That's Ellen Hartley's daughter, Macy. She's been over in the Mideast fighting for our country." As she made her way to her mother in the middle of the pew, people she passed welcomed and thanked her. Ellen Hartley stood and, weeping, threw her arms around her daughter. "Didn't she know she was coming?" Frank asked. "I don't think so. I think it was a very last-minute thing." The 2 men sat quietly, remembering their own reunions of this type. "I'm glad she could make it for the service," Jerome whispered, and Frank nodded. In one of the pews toward the back, a young man walked in and sat down, looking a little bewildered and stunned. "Do you know him?" Frank asked. Jerome shook his head and then pointed to Mr. Donovan, who was serving as an usher tonight. Tall and lanky, Ed Donovan went and introduced himself to the young man. Almost instantly, they all knew that his name was Timothy. He had never come to church before, but grew up in a nearby village. He had no relatives here. And then they all realized that this was Timothy, who had been born Tiffany. With nowhere else to go, he had found his way here. "I just wanted to come for Christmas," Jerome heard him say to Ed Donovan, as Ed sat down next to the boy. "You're very welcome here," Ed said, extending his hand to shake at the same time he wrapped his arm around the young boy. "Everyone is welcome here." And the lad, who must have been no more than 17 or 18, began to cry, just as the organist started playing "Away in a Manger." Jerome and Frank just looked at each other as the music washed over them. The congregation continued to grow. People moved closer and closer to each other as the pews filled up, and in walked a young family, a father, a mother, and a young son who was, probably around 6 or 7. They were wearing tattered clothes and made the sign of the cross on themselves before being welcomed to a seat, surrounded by others who embraced them and made a space for them in the middle of their row. The boy was handed a homemade doll by the woman sitting next to him, and he crawled into her lap. Everyone could tell that they were newly displaced from their home country, and somehow it ended up here for the evening service. Even the balcony was getting crowded, and suddenly Frank felt a gloved hand on his shoulder as a man leaned forward and said, "Frank, is that you?" Turning around, he saw his best friend from college, whom he hadn't seen in 50 or 60 years. "Pete?" he exclaimed excitedly. "Pete, is that really you? How did you get here?" The 2 men stood and hugged with a bench between them. "Same as you," he laughed. "But I wanted to try someplace different this Christmas Eve, and I remembered you talking about your church. This is it, isn't it?" He smiled, looking around. "You were right about the windows. They're beautiful. And is that old Mrs. Stanley at the organ? I can't believe she's still playing." "Well, it is Christmas Eve," Frank chuckled. "What else would she be doing?" Let's talk more after the service, Pete said, and he patted Frank on the shoulder as both men sat back down. After listening a little more to the organ prelude, Frank turned to Jerome. You're kind of quiet tonight. Everything okay? His friend thought for a moment and then, looking straight ahead, managed to say, I thought Mary would be here with me tonight. I guess I'll have to wait until next year. Frank nodded. He was still waiting for Becca, too. Yeah, I know that longing, my friend. Jerome cast him a sideways glance as Frank continued, Becca's waiting for our granddaughter. Jerome looked at him with great curiosity. I didn't know you had a granddaughter, he said. When? But Frank held up his hand to stop the questions. I don't know yet. You know how that works, but I think that as she's about to be born, they will call her Noelle. I think that Becca is going to be with her so they can come here together. Jerome understood and nodded, laying his hand on his friend's leg. It's all okay. We know that now. I've been told that my Mary, you know she was a nurse all her life, right? I've heard through the grapevine that she's helping people cross over in Ukraine and the Middle East this Christmas. It's a working holiday for her. As much as I'd like her to be with me, she has her work to do. Jerome smiled, a prideful and loving smile. Both men nodded and directed their attention to one of the ministers at the front of the sanctuary, who stood, faced the congregation, and began the service. We welcome you all home tonight on this sacred and holy eve. We have all come from different places and different times to celebrate in the warm memories and ever unfolding light that this night brings to us. And she introduced the first hymn, Good Christian Friends, Rejoice. After that, the story was retold. A young girl chosen by God to bear the Christ child, and her betrothed who believed her story and stood by her. At what seemed like the absolutely appropriate time, Destiny's baby cried ever so softly, and they could all hear her mother comforting her, just as Mary must have done with the baby Jesus. Different ministers who had served the congregation at different times led various portions of the service, and tonight's reflection was about opening our hearts to live in the light, remembering the times before, but embracing the truth of Jesus' birth that happens every year in the Bethlehem of our hearts. We carry these places with us, Pastor Everhart said. This church. Places where we've been, places we've only read about. The stories of shepherds and wise men who traveled far and wide to follow the star, we carry them within us. The Bethlehem story, the crucifixion story, the resurrection story, they are all living inside of us. People we have known, people who have known us, Christmas pageants and choral masterpieces. The year that our friend from England was here and read the roll of Lumina, the spark of light that shone through the star, her voice washing over us and through us with the memories of Christmases past. The year of the guitarist whose rendition of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, had us sitting in silence after he finished because no one wanted to move and break the spell. Those are all here now. And we have much to be grateful for. Here ends part 1 of our story. Home for Christmas, part 2. The service continued in the old wooden church in the woods. Frank and Jerome sang out with gusto and listened to the scripture readings. But of course, it was different for them now than it had been when they were sitting in these pews all those years ago. Because now they knew the reality that before they only wondered about. Pastor Everhart was right. They do carry these places inside them, always and always. "Where's home, Daddy?" Frank's son had once asked him. "It's where your heart is, Danny," Frank had answered. Little did he know at the time just how true that was. "My home is here," Frank thought. "Every year I come home for Christmas because it reminds me of who I am." "And whose you are," Jerome smiled. "Wait, you you heard that?" Frank said. Or did he say it? Did he only think it? "You're such a novice about this stuff," his friend chided. "Of course I heard you. We all hear you," at which point several people looked up at the two men and smiled. "In this place, we are all spirit. We hear and experience everything. We are all one. We are connected. There is no separation. That's how we all knew that young Timothy down there, well, had been through so much when Ed Donovan sat down next to him. That's how we all knew about Macy's homecoming. That's how everyone here knows that I'm waiting for my Mary and that you're awaiting Becca and Noel." Frank sat in silence for a moment. "But I don't feel like this is my first time here at this gathering. I feel like I've been here every year." Jerome leaned into him sideways. "Because you have been, Frank. That's a part of us there's a part of us that just knows exactly what's going on here. But when we're living in the other world, we can't truly be here yet. So it feels like a dream or a make-believe place. But it's all real. It's all real, Frank," he added. "Remembering who we are celebrating here. Oh, sure, some of us, some of it's about Jesus and Mary and Joseph and even the wee donkey. But it's really about our Creator God, Frank. God is the one who put all of this in motion. God is the one who caused Jesus to be born. And it's God that Jesus came to bring us closer to. Remember? It's this baby who grows up to teach us how to live and die and live again." And then just when the minister stopped, they looked at each other. And the pastor spoke again, saying, "As I invite you to join with those in our story now, and to pray as Jesus teaches us to pray together, I invite you to join us as well." Our Creator God, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. And when they had finished the prayer, the entire church began to shimmer and become almost translucent with waves of energy and light. Just then their attention was drawn to the creche in the front of the sanctuary. A special light seemed to shine upon it, or no, it wasn't shining on it, it was shining from it, emanating from the scene itself. And all around the world, a holy silence, a sacred peace took root in everyone's heart, if only for a moment. Let us light our own lights and take that light into the world. As we think of all those who have sung, who will sing throughout the ages of that quiet, silent place where we hold everything in reverence. For truly, this is a silent night. us pray. Holy God, God of light and wonder, of starlight and shepherds, of travelers and wanderers, and of those who have no permanent place to stay. You who invite us to come close. The ones who are carrying heavy loads and crying out in the murkiness of barns and marginalized places in our cities and our towns, and those looking for a safe place, those looking to have their hearts be safe. You bring us together in these moments with the promises of new life, a new possibility offered, a tender mercy spoken here, and a kind deed done there. You bring us together in our hearts and imaginations, just as Frank and Jerome and others in our story tonight have stayed together beyond this life, nourished by the memories of Christmases past and led forward by the thoughts of Christmases future. We are all seeking you. We seek your light. We seek you in the silence of our prayers and in the solitude of our quiet moments, in the love of family, whether biological or chosen. We seek you because your way is everlasting, and it is to us the promise of everlasting peace and wholeness and your perfect shalom. You come to us in silent nights and in the soft, rhythmic sound of angel wings. You come to us in stories of grace and gratitude. The thing is, you come to us, and you have come to us to live as one of us, to be with us, O God, as Emmanuel. On this Christmas Eve, may we join those in our story of a snowy little mountain church in the woods and enter into the magic and the mystery of your holy birth, we ask. Amen. And so it is that every Christmas Eve, in our own way, we join Frank and Jerome and Pete and Mrs. Stanley and Macy and Destiny and her baby and the McIntyres and all of those former ministers. We join them with the people from our own lives and locations, and we settle back in with them for the end of our Christmas story. For following the singing of Silent Night from behind where Frank and Jerome and Pete and the others were sitting in the balcony, rising ever so slowly on the droning hum of angel wings, the first strains of voices could be heard. Christmas morning, Frank smiled, looking at Jerome for confirmation. Christmas morning, Jerome said, as everyone in the little church instinctively rose, while the sound increased and they were all totally encompassed by the loving light of creation, vibrating, resonating with every cell of their being. The church building fell away. The distance between the people no longer existed, and they were together as one, singing praises to the highest heaven together, singing that angels we have heard on high, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Merry Christmas, everybody. God bless. Be safe, take care, and bye for now.